Hello, this presentation is concerned with informal fallacies. So we've talked about fallacies before, but just as a reminder, a fallacy, just in general, just what it means to be a fallacy, it's an error in reasoning of some kind or another. In chapter 1, we talked about formal fallacies. So something in this context is formal, not because it's the opposite of casual, but because it has to do with the form or the structure of the argument, the pattern of reasoning that exists in the argument. That's what we mean by the form of the argument. So a formal fallacy would be when we're getting the structure of the argument wrong, because there's certain argument forms that are always deductively valid. But if you get the form a little bit wrong in some subtle way, then it might look like it's a deductively valid argument, but it's actually not. It's deductively invalid. And if you mistake a invalid argument form for a deductively valid argument form, then you've committed a formal fallacy. But today we're going to be dealing with informal fallacies. So again, this isn't a casual fallacy. It just means that it's a fallacy that has something to do with the argument other than the form of the argument. And so usually it's something about the content, right? In fact, some of these arguments, it might turn out, are actually deductively valid, but they're not good arguments because there's something about their content. There's something else that's weird going on that makes these bad arguments. Okay, so 3 general categories that we'll look at. And so these are the categories that are in the book too. And I've added in a couple other sort of examples within each category, but we'll kind of go through these one at a time. So starting, of course, here with number 1, fallacies of irrelevance. So maybe this is obvious just by the title, but these are arguments where somebody appeals to facts or consequences or something that's just simply irrelevant to the validity or the cogency or, of the argument itself. Let's look at some examples. Here's a really famous one. Even if you've never heard this term ad hominem fallacy, you probably know what's being talked about here. So this is, as it says, directing an argument towards some irrelevant characteristic of the person that's presenting an argument, right? So you disagree with them, or you want to disagree with them, but instead of addressing the argument that they're actually presenting, you point to some irrelevant characteristic about them and use that as a reason for rejecting their argument. And we've got 3 subtypes. So the first one is the abusive ad hominem fallacy. And so this is picking out some personal characteristic or some affiliation or something that they might have, something about them as a person, and using that, like thinking of that characteristic of them as somehow bad, whether it really is or not, but thinking of it as bad and using that as a reason for rejecting their argument. So let's think about some guy, Bob, and maybe he's a nutritionist, and he's giving us all these really good reasons in favor of having a balanced diet and making sure we're getting all the essential nutrients and avoiding junk food and that sort of thing. But I don't really want to pay attention to what Bob has to say. So I say, oh yeah, I don't believe that guy, Bob, because he is, you know, and then I pick something about him, right? He is has a certain political persuasion, or he belongs to a certain religion, or a certain racial group, or a certain gender, or something like that. And I use that as a reason for rejecting his argument, which obviously is irrelevant to whether he's making a good argument about nutrition. Or, you know, it's common nowadays with lots of, especially like the late night talk show hosts, to talk about Donald Trump and reject him somehow by saying he has bad hair, or he has like unusual skin tone or something like that, and using that as sort of this blanket argument against him and his ideas or his policies or any of those sorts of things. And, you know, maybe those are good for laughs or whatever, but they're just not good arguments against his policies or his ideas. Or, you know, somebody, maybe they have an annoying voice. This was certainly, you know, when we were thinking back to the last presidential election, people cited Hillary Clinton and her clothing or the way her voice sounded to them or something, and this was a reason to reject her without ever addressing any of her ideas or policy proposals or anything. This one is similar, going back to especially the 2008 presidential election when Barack Obama was elected. that I definitely saw some people who said that they were not going to vote for him. They just couldn't support him because his middle name is Hussein. And remember that the former leader of Iraq was Saddam Hussein. And now we've got this person whose middle name is Hussein. And so that's a reason, I guess, for sort of rejecting that person and their ideas. Clearly, this is a fallacy, right? This has nothing to do with his quality as a politician or as a person or anything like that. It's just merely a fallacy. Okay, moving on. Circumstantial ad hominem is similar, but it's more about sort of especially citing whether somebody has to gain by some policy or some new plan that's being proposed. So for example, let's say that somebody is arguing in favor of increased funding for Medicare. And maybe they've got a really good argument, but it just so happens that this person is a senior citizen and they're enrolled in Medicare and they receive Medicare benefits. And so somebody might say, oh yeah, well, you're only presenting that argument. You're only in favor of increased Medicare spending because you get benefits from Medicare. And so you stand to benefit from increased funding of Medicare. Like, well, that may be that they're going to receive that benefit, but that has nothing to do with whether their argument is good or bad. In fact, maybe their argument is really bad. And if it is, then you should go after that, right? Explain why this argument is bad, as opposed to sort of citing this irrelevant thing about whether they're going to win or lose as a result of accepting their argument. Or you might say, oh, well, this person's argument about certain tax policy, or maybe they're going to argue that we should reduce a certain kind of taxation. It's like, oh well, I'm going to reject that person's argument because they belong to some like relatively radical anti-tax group of some kind, right? Anti-tax advocacy group. Like, well, okay, maybe that sort of gives us reasons for why they are interested in that argument, but it says nothing about the quality of the argument itself. So here's a third kind of ad hominem. The tu quoque is the fancy Latin name for this, but it's really just a charge of hypocrisy. Let's go back to Bob and his argument in favor of good nutrition, and he's given us all these great reasons for having a balanced diet and avoiding bad foods. We say, oh well, I'm not going to accept his argument because he himself eats junk food, so he's a hypocrite, so therefore his argument is wrong. Like, well, the fact that he's not following the guidelines doesn't mean that the arguments in favor of those guidelines is bad. They might be really strong reasons and the guidelines might be really excellent. It's just that Bob himself needs to follow his own guidelines. Or another one that maybe you've seen before is somebody's advancing some kind of pro-environmentalism policies, maybe reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, but then somebody says, oh, well, we can just dismiss that person's argument because they drive a car, in particular a gasoline-powered car. Like, okay, maybe there is some level of hypocrisy going on there, but that doesn't mean their argument is wrong or that it's bad somehow. If you really want to argue against them, you got to go after the argument, not after the person. Okay, next one. So a straw man argument. And actually, before even sort of talking about any of these examples or anything, let me just give you kind of the origin of the term. So suppose that you've challenged me to a duel, right? Like we're going to fight. That you've challenged me to fight after school or something, and but I'm scared, right? I'm worried that I'm not going to win, right? In fact, I might think there's a good chance I'm going to lose. And so instead of showing up and actually fighting you and seeing who wins, instead I construct sort of like a scarecrow. It's made out of straw, it's just shirt and pants all stuffed with straw. And then maybe it sort of looks kind of a little bit like you. But then I say, this is the person that I'm fighting, and I smash it because it's so easy to smash because it's just a flimsy thing made out of straw. But then I declare victory. It's like, aha, I beat you. See, I won. It's like, well, I didn't really win anything, right? I didn't win the fight against you because I didn't actually fight you. I fought a straw man version of you. So then when we bring this to logic and argumentation, what's going on is instead of directing your comments towards somebody's actual argument or their actual beliefs or their actual theory or something, instead you kind of make up an easily defeatable version of their viewpoints or an easily defeatable version of their argument. And then you defeat that because it's so easy to defeat it, and then declare victory against the person, against the actual argument. But of course, you haven't addressed the actual argument. You've just addressed the fake, easily defeated version of their argument. So you might have seen this, seems like every December we go through the same business of, say like at Starbucks, they come up with some like holiday themed cups and stuff, and people get all bent out of shape out of this. So they might say something like this, right? People who say happy holidays, they're waging a war on Christmas. And waging a war on Christmas means you hate Christianity. So therefore, people who say happy holidays, they hate Christianity. Like, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's not why they're saying happy holidays. It has nothing to do with why they're saying happy holidays. They're trying to be more inclusive. Not everybody is Christian. There's a variety of different holidays that are happening during that same time of year. So rather than just sort of zeroing in on Christmas, they say happy holidays so that everybody feels included. And so then to twist that into saying that if you are saying happy holidays, then you hate Christmas or you hate Christianity or something, that doesn't have anything to do with the reality of why they're saying that. And so there's no point, right? It's an obvious fallacy, and it's very annoying because it happens every year. So here's another one I've seen many times, and I actually used this in a previous presentation. So somebody might have heard a little bit about evolutionary theory, and they heard that new species evolve from other species, or current species can evolve into another species in the future. And so from that, they take it to this, right? That evolutionary theory says that cats will turn into dogs. Well, cats are not turning into dogs, so therefore evolutionary theory must be false. Like, well, that's a silly version of evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory does not say that cats will turn into dogs. It doesn't say that a currently existing species will turn into another currently existing species. That's not what it says at all. And so if that's what you're arguing against a theory that nobody believes in. And so you're just wasting your time. Okay, next one here. Appeal to force. This one's pretty obvious what's going on here. I'm threatening you with some bad consequences, some violence perhaps, if you don't agree with my argument. And this is sort of a clear example, comes from like cliche mafia threats, right? And they might just say simply like, you should pay us money or else we'll beat you up, right? We'll deliver violence upon you. But they might just imply it, right? There's an implied threat here. And so kind of the cliche is, oh, you should give us the money because it would be a real shame if something bad happened to your beautiful house. It's like, so why are they talking about something bad happening in my beautiful house? Clearly because they are going to make something bad happen to my beautiful house if I don't pay them money. So the threat isn't direct, but it's pretty obvious that that's what they mean. Okay, next one, appeal to the people. One version of this might be just that, well, everybody believes this, or the majority of people believe this, so therefore you should believe it too. And just because the majority of people believe something, that in and of itself is not decisive reason for believing it too. It could mean that, like, well, maybe that's reason for giving it some extra consideration. It's like, wow, if everybody believes this, maybe there's a reason, so I should look into it. But just merely because a bunch of people believe something, that's not decisive, not a decisive reason for me to believe it too. But another version, the one that they spell out more clearly in the book, is that they imply, or they just simply say, that acceptance of a conclusion will lead to social acceptance of some kind, right? There's this group that you want to be accepted with, and they all believe something, or they all behave in a certain way. So you should conform to them in order to be accepted in that group. Right? So if the reason for doing something, the reason for smoking a cigarette is because all the cool kids are doing it, like, well, that's not a good reason for smoking cigarettes. But even though it might actually be true that sort of you'll be perceived as cool, you'll be accepted into this group that you think is the cool kids. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean it's a good idea to follow that behavior. Or, there might be patriotic reasons, sign up for some civic duty, run for office, join the military, something like that. Because why? Well, that will show everybody that you're a true patriot and everybody will sort of accept you as a good patriotic American. Like, well, okay, that maybe you'll be accepted in that way, but that's not in and of itself a good reason for following that policy or that plan. All right, another one, and this is definitely one we've talked about in previous presentations and that exists in previous chapters, the appeal to emotion. All right, so the emotive content of argument that's being presented in natural language. And they're using that emotive content to try to get people to lean towards accepting the author's conclusion. And so if you engage some of these emotions, then they're less likely to pay super close attention to the actual logical structure of the argument itself and just get on board with it because they're sort of worked up about it. And the research shows that negative emotions tend to work better this way. If people feel scared, then they're more likely to accept sort of a radical conclusion of eliminating the thing that's causing the fear, even if it's sort of really kind of a minor threat. But if you get really worked up about it and you're very scared of it, you might take really dramatic action to eliminate a really minor threat. Right? And so engaging people's emotions can work really well. So fear, disgust, anger, but then also positive ones, you get people's sense of joy, satisfaction, happiness, something like that, contentment. This can also sort of like get people on board with what you want them to do. It's just not quite as effective, for good or for bad. It's not quite as effective as the negative ones. But positive or negative, just your emotional reaction or the emotional content that's included in the argument itself shouldn't make any difference for our judgment about whether the argument itself is actually a good argument, whether it's actually valid or it's actually cogent. Okay, appeal to ignorance. So this is an interesting one, using our lack of knowledge as a reason for or against a particular conclusion. And just because we don't have enough information, that in and of itself should not be reason in favor of a conclusion. So I think this is best if we look at some examples, right? So scientists have never proven that there's no such thing as ghosts. So therefore, ghosts exist. Like, okay, yeah, scientists have never proven that there's no such thing as ghosts, but that in and of itself is not a good reason for believing that ghosts exist. We need all kinds of independent evidence in favor of ghosts existing to accept that conclusion. Going the other direction, so somebody who's an atheist might say, well, religious people cannot prove that God exists, so therefore God doesn't exist. Like, okay, well, the premise is true, but that's an accurate premise, but that in and of itself should not be any kind of decisive reason in favor of believing that God does not exist. Just because we haven't proven that he does exist. Now, this is one, like many of these others, we do have to be a little careful with this because if we're dealing with some argument that has to do with probabilities and reasoning under uncertainty, then it might be important to recognize that we have sort of a level of ignorance, that we don't know everything, we haven't proven something conclusively, we don't have a deductively sound argument in favor of a conclusion, and that might be reasons for or against some other belief. So it's a little tricky, but if the only reason in favor of a conclusion is because of our ignorance about whether this has been proven true or false, that in and of itself isn't good reasons. Isn't a good reason for believing a conclusion. All right. Here's sort of a catch-all that they include in the book. A red herring or sort of missing the point, sort of distracting. And there's so many different ways of doing this. They just kind of lumped them all into this one category, red herring. So somehow or another, the premises are just really just irrelevant, right? They just don't have anything to do with the conclusion. So, here's a couple of examples, right? Changing the subject. So, somebody's faced with something difficult, some difficult argument or difficult question, and they just switch to another topic and hope that we forget that they were faced with this difficult topic. Or they might just start bringing in like random information that doesn't have anything to do with the conclusion or anything to do with the topic at hand, but then they claim that it does, and it just sort of everything gets muddled. Dissembling or distracting, very similar, where you just start going on and on and on. You keep these rambling, long run-on sentences, and you just keep going and going and going, and you explain around and around and around and around, and you never quite get back to the point, and you're just hoping that people forget what the point was, and they forget that you just have never really addressed this. So this is an extremely common technique among politicians in particular, where they're faced with a tough question at a press conference or in a political debate or something, and so they don't really want to address that because it will make them look bad, and so they just start distracting, right? They come up with all these other things, they answer some other question, they just say some things that they want to say that have nothing to do with the question that they've been asked, and they just hope that we forget that they never came back to addressing the question at hand or addressing the argument that they've been presented with. Okay, so here's one that's actually not in the book, but I think it's an important one to understand. It's usually called the naturalistic fallacy. You might see this with a few different labels. This is the label that I like for it. And so just in general, this is sort of like citing the way things are now, or the way things have always been, or the way things were in the past, and using that as a reason for the way things should be right now, right? So we might look at some policy or some practice and say like, well, what's the justification for this? This seems like kind of a dumb thing for us to be doing. And then somebody says, oh, well, it's because that's tradition. That's the way we've always done it, so that's the way we're going to keep doing it. That's not a very good reason for continuing to do some things the same way, merely because that's the way they've been done in the past. Now, it could be that these things have been done that way in the past for good reasons, but then we need to look at what those reasons are. Just talking about the fact that this is the way things have always been done, that in and of itself that's not a good reason, right? So that's certainly not a decisive reason for keeping things the same way as they have always been. Another example people might bring up is sort of biological characteristics or sort of evolutionary things. So we see this all the time in arguments involving vegetarianism. So somebody might have like this very good argument in favor of vegetarianism, and they say, it might be ethically unjustifiable to be continuing to eat animals. And then somebody says, oh, well, we're not obligated to be vegetarians because humans have always eaten meat. Okay, yeah, like humans in the past certainly ate meat. Sort of we've evolved the ability to process meat proteins, right? Animal proteins. We've got the certain teeth and the digestive enzymes and so on to be able to do it. So it certainly is something that has happened in the past, but that in and of itself is not a good reason for continuing the practice. Right? Because think of all the terrible things that humans have done in the past, and maybe they were done for survival reasons, right? Sort of rejecting strangers, and so xenophobia or racism or something, or then sexism or warfare. These are things that humans did all the time in the past. That in and of itself is not a good reason for continuing to do those things or continuing to hold those beliefs. So yeah. This is a fallacy, right? Just because things have been a certain way, that doesn't automatically mean that they should be that way. So here's another one. This is the last one I'll do for this little presentation. The appeal to origin fallacy, sometimes called the genetic fallacy. And when they call it the genetic fallacy, that doesn't mean it has anything to do with DNA. It's just like, what's the genesis? Like, what's the origin of this idea? So it's citing the source of an idea or an argument as a reason for dismissing the argument itself. And usually what's going on is that it's a bad person, some individual or some group that we really dislike. And then somebody presents an idea, and so let's say that, for example, it was something that Hitler had talked about in the 1930s or something, and somebody presents a belief or an argument, and we say, oh, who else thought that? Hitler. And so therefore we should reject your ideas. It's like, well, just merely because Hitler thought of something, that in and of itself isn't reason for thinking it's a bad idea. Now, Hitler had a lot of bad ideas. It's dangerous to talk this way, right? Hitler had tons of bad ideas, and so just on average, yeah, Hitler's ideas were pretty bad. We don't want to keep company with him, but he was also a person, right? And so if he had ideas about nutrition, maybe they were good, like accurate, right? One that we see in philosophy a lot is there's a wide variety really sort of paradigmatic historical arguments or theories from really famous philosophers in the past. They're really interesting and important and extremely influential. So, you know, if you're a student of philosophy, you absolutely need to learn about these important historical philosophers' ideas. But if we really look into their personal details, a lot of those old philosophers turn out to be not very nice people. You know, there's a really good chance that they were sexist or racist or, you know, had really questionable political affiliations. So there might be a lot of problems associated with those people. But just because the people had sort of character flaws, that doesn't automatically mean their arguments were bad or their theories are bad. And so if we cite their personal characteristics, then this is getting to be more like an ad hominem, right? Where we're rejecting an idea just merely because it came from a bad source. Or on the other hand, this could be a problem kind of in the other direction, accepting an idea because it came from a good source, right? So think of, you know, I don't know, Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa or somebody that we hold up as sort of a morally wonderful person, or maybe a saint of some kind. Well, even saints can have some bad ideas, right, or bad arguments. And so merely because it came from a good source doesn't automatically mean it's a good argument. Okay, so that's the end of the fallacies of irrelevance. And so I'll go ahead and stop there.